Hi, I'm Hannah Pappenfuss,
And I'm Linka Winterstein.
and this is our presentation, The Treatment of Disabled Individuals in Ecuador versus the United States. That was part of our Spanish for Health Professions class. So today we'll be discussing the treatment of individuals with disabilities in Ecuador and the United States, specifically as it pertains to legal protections, educational opportunities, and incidents of violence and abuse. And I'll let Linka take it away with her explanation of Ecuador.
Thank you, Hannah. So a little bit more about disability in Ecuador. Ecuador, as compared to the United States, has fewer large-scale studies that really can focus in and describe through mathematics and statistics the lives and quality of life of people who have disabilities in Ecuador. However, the first large-scale national survey of disability occurred in Ecuador in 2005, and this established that approximately 12.1% of the population suffers from some kind of life-affecting impairment. However, the actual expression of quality of life for those 12.1% of Ecuadorians can vary significantly between urban, rural, and jungle areas, where beliefs and attitudes regarding the causes of disability and the treatment of disabled individuals varies widely. However, overall in Ecuador, there has been a recent surge in legislation and public feeling towards the improvement of the quality of life of disabled people in Ecuador. This has largely been driven by the recent presidential candidates, Rafael Correa and Lenin Moreno Garces, who have continuously won for the same party and moved forward with significant disability legislation. So some of that legislation really became pertinent when Ecuador ratified a new constitution in 2008. Following the 2007 election of a new president, significant legislation focus on the rights and quality of life of disabled individuals became a central part of the new constitution. Several different articles mentioned the rights of disabled individuals specifically, including Article 47, which guarantees access to all goods and services for both able and disabled individuals. Now, this is incredibly significant since access to all goods and services hypothetically includes education opportunities, job opportunities, living situations, food, and other important resources. One of the important outspurts of Article 47 has been the 4% policy, which mandates that both large and small businesses hire approximately 4% of their workers from people who have some degree of disability or otherwise life-affecting impairment. In order to actually ensure that this policy is being proactively put to use amongst the public and in actual corporations and jobs, the government also created several government agencies in several different key parts of Ecuador in order to monitor whether or not the policy is correctly being implemented. So these government monitoring citizen observatories are placed in Quito, Guayaquil, and Loja. As you can see on the map, those are central mountainous regions and slightly coastal regions of Ecuador, which tend to be highly dense and populous, Quito, of course, being the capital of Ecuador. However, as you might notice on the map, the eastern side of Ecuador, which is primarily rainforested region, tends to have a longer distance to some of these urban centers where these citizen observatories are occurring. This means that especially in far more rural and jungle communities such as Shell, Coca, and other similar or really rural areas, government oversight and ensurement that the 4% policy is properly giving jobs to people with disabilities is a little bit harder to come by. So in terms of education opportunities in Ecuador, while the recent policies, including the Buen Vivir development model, emphasize that human fulfillment and quality of life are tied to education opportunities, both for disabled and able individuals in Ecuador, the actual opportunities and access can vary significantly. Even though there have been additional spending on education, including the creation of new schools and new specialty schools, a lot of that funding has gone to more urban areas, so that more rural areas and jungle areas still struggle to provide proper access to education for both able and disabled Ecuadorian children. For able Ecuadorians, Access to post-secondary education can be very difficult, primarily because post-secondary educational programs tend to either designate your career for you if you receive government subsidies, or are extremely expensive for you to pursue your own education. For families in Ecuador, especially rural families in Ecuador that already struggle to provide resources and access to education for their children, providing those resources for disabled children can be an additional insurmountable hurdle. For disabled children in Ecuador, there are several key barriers, including proximity to public and specialty schools, which is primarily a problem for rural and jungle individuals. Transportation and availability can vary widely. Being able to actually reach a school, even if there is one nearby, is key, especially for rural and jungle children. There are additionally severe social pressures to work rather than learn. Since it's so difficult to actually achieve post-secondary education, there are strong pressures societally in rural and in especially rural areas for children to instead go and work with their families. In addition, many public schools have strict dress codes that require uniforms and hair to a specific length. This can be difficult to achieve for families that don't have the resources to pay for things like uniforms, providing an additional barrier for children to receive proper education. In terms of violence and abuse, domestic violence in general is relatively common in Ecuador. This is especially seen in cycles of domestic violence between male and female partners, and then passing on from fathers onto children. In this, as is seen in many different parts of the world, especially for disabled children, abuse by a parent or other caregiver is relatively common. Especially in regions that are rural and jungle areas, different beliefs about the treatment of disabled individuals can result in even increased rates of violence and abuse. Although there are few specific studies that provide strong data points, interviews with workers of the rural foster home Casa de Fe have provided insight into some of the care and treatment of disabled individuals in the region. According to those individuals from Casa de Fe, many people who especially live in jungle regions are guided primarily by the hierarchical structure of their community, which places a single leader in a position to determine whether or not a disabled child is taken care of or abandoned in the jungle. Another alternative, of course, would be trying to make it to a more urban center, but walking from a jungle area and jungle community to even a rural city such as Shell, where Casa de Fe is located, can take a mother several days by foot. As a result, several disabled children, both in rural and jungle areas, never make it to areas where there are more specialized care facilities, such as Casa de Fe and specialty schools. This means that for parents and other caregivers of those disabled children for whom resources are scarce, we see increased treatment of disabled children as less than human. There have been cases where children were kept like dogs underneath the porch, where they were starved, they've been beaten and abandoned. Although there aren't specific numbers on these instances, they happen with enough regularity to be thought of as a relatively common occurrence in rural Ecuador.
With regard to the United States, it is estimated that 25% of adults, or 61 million people, have some sort of disability. Beginning in the 1970s, but culminating in the 1990s, the disability rights movement began, and there was greater pushes for accessibility and societal acceptance that culminated with the Americans with Disabilities Act. However, there are still issues in the sphere of social participation, education, and gender-based violence. As far as general legal protections go, the main law is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, and the ADA details physical requirements for buildings, such as how long or how wide doorways need to be to accommodate wheelchairs, and the specific slope of ramps that is required in order to be usable by people in wheelchairs. It also prohibits discrimination by businesses and employers on the basis of disability, saying that they must provide a reasonable accommodation. Now, as you can probably tell by that big language, there is some debate over what is considered reasonable. And because of this, the ADA has what's called the undue burden caveat, where businesses or employers are not legally obligated to provide someone with a disability something that could constitute an undue burden on their part, such as if they requested you to take out all of the stairs and replace them with elevators, or add elevators in rather. Along those same lines, there's also the grandfather clause, which states that because some buildings were made so long ago, it's unfeasible in order to try to retrofit them. And so buildings made before a certain time period are exempt from the requirements of the ADA. In terms of educational opportunities and protections, the main piece of legislation here is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, and it says all students who qualify for special education must have an IEP, which stands for an individualized educational plan, where services are coordinated through case managers and psychologists and occupational therapists and the like. It also states that students need to have the least restrictive environment possible to their learning. Typically, this means that it is always the goal to mainstream a student into classes with their non-disabled peers, unless it is not physically or behaviorally possible to do so. Thirdly, the act stipulates that students have the right to free and appropriate public education, and it provides safeguards to privacy for the students and their family. Some limitations in the United States, of course, are funding, which, like urban and rural areas, tend to also play out economic divides, as well as variability of teaching qualifications. So, for example, in states where it is not required to have a teaching license, it's also not required to have any licensing for special ed, which means that the people who are working in those positions aren't always the best qualified or trained in inclusive education. In terms of violence and abuse, according to a report by the Justice Department, people with disabilities are 3 times more likely to be sexually assaulted compared to their peers, and twice as likely to be victims of violent crime. According to a 2017 fact sheet by the YWCA, 97 to 99% of said violence is perpetrated by family members and other caregivers. And despite the fact that people with cognitive impairments experience the highest level of sexual assaults, only 3% of those cases ever go reported, in large part because the victims will likely not be believed.
So in terms of a final comparison between Ecuador and the United States, while Ecuador has new general legislation thanks to the 2008 Constitution, there are still significant variabilities in education opportunities provided by the new funding coming out of those legal protections in urban, rural, and jungle areas. In addition, variations in beliefs and attitudes towards disabled individuals has resulted in incredible in amounts of abandonment and family violence experienced by disabled individuals, although specific numbers are not known in Ecuador.
Furthermore, in the United States, there are also significant legal protections, and significant strides have been made to ensuring equality, but there are still several barriers to education, violence, and social participation, although we are seeing progress. Thank you for listening to our presentation.